So we had a great panel. Uh, the way we'll run this now is we'll have some internal discussion in the panel. I'll have a series of questions, and then we'll open up to the floor. So the first thing that I have is we talk a lot about the drivers behind this currently completely unacceptable situation, market failures, others, some ways, some very good ways of addressing this. But this is clearly not enough. What else needs to happen is not happening, and how do we make that happen? Not all of you need to come in on every single question, so whatever, whoever wants to go, and whichever order, please go ahead.
Can I think what we're doing here is actually one way in which we can bring change much faster, and it is to actually talk to one another, and because there are a lot of efforts, individual efforts, and we're talking to one another informally, but I think you know, having these forums where we're learning from other practices, and we've been watching the AA very closely and learning from them because they have a longer history. But I think we need more of those kind of forums. We now have the International Economic Association, the Latin American Economic Association doing, starting to do these kind of things, and I think we need to. All of us need to really think about because this is a global problem. It's not an isolated problem.
Do more, build a momentum.
Yes.
So I'd like to thank you for that question. I'd like to take this opportunity to delve a little deeper on this new initiative, because I mentioned the stalled progress in the numbers not improving. In fact, they've petered out, and after the pandemic, our last report, which is a survey of departments, showed that some troubling trends in that the number of women entering PhD programs is falling, the number of women econ majors is falling, the number of women getting full professorship is falling, and I don't know if this is just a fallout from the pandemic, where we know there were these disparate impacts on women. But these are some troubling trends. And part of it has to do, as I mentioned, with the climate in the profession, which has tolerated discrimination and sexual harassment, right? So now the question is, how do you institute systemic change? So as you were mentioning, this is a 30, 40-year problem when you're trying to actually change institutions. And so what this initiative that we got some funding for is trying to do is the ultimate goal is systemic institutional change within the economics profession. So, you know, the next question is, well, how do you do that, right? And so the specific interventions, as I mentioned this before, are gathering information because we need data. And the second is new programming activities that are going to target the senior leaders within the profession and the younger generation for more persistent change. So what it is, so, you know, our goal is gender parity in the economics profession. That's our North Star. And so this is this profession-wide intervention that is designed to improve the professional climate in order to attract more women and make it easier for them to succeed by resetting norms. And so I think what the initiative really talks about is how do we sort of speed this process up and have fewer talented economists opt out of the profession. So what it is the target is a 3-year initiative that will target all 254 economics departments. Some grant PhDs, others don't. And to attempt to engage the leadership ranks within the departments, which is the department chairs, the directors of undergraduate studies, the directors of graduate studies. You know, this organization mostly works with groups in the Global South. So the question is, well, what is the implications of this for the Global South? And I sort of gave one example, which is that the Department of Economics at the University of Chile has 33 faculty members. 23 of them got their PhDs in the US. So whatever norms are being set in the US PhD programs are being exported to wherever the economists are getting their jobs. So there can be these positive spillover effects if the climate improves because the norms and expectations have changed. And so really, so I'll just tell you the initiatives we're planning, which is speaking of the code of conduct, there's also best practices in hiring, in compensation, in retention, in service allocation tasks, in terms of conscious and unconscious bias, implicit bias training, etc. So a best practices conference for chairs of economics departments. And Ellen Ray was here earlier and she said, could you include department chairs from Europe? And I think that, there's a strong argument to be made that these are administrative roles that most of the time people get commiserations and condolences for, oh, you have to be department chair now. So instead, if you look at the corporate world, people are actually groomed to be leaders, right? They don't just fall into department chair position. They are actually trained to take on those roles. So to try and bring a little bit more of that culture into economics and include sexual harassment training, then a women in leadership workshop to try and help women in a more intentional way occupy leadership roles where they can have that power and influence. And then also at the mid-career level, a peer mentoring workshop, which is again international. So anyone who's an associate professor who wants to, get to the full professor rank, we're going to be doing another cohort. And that's to create community and support at the mid-career ranks. And then, as I mentioned earlier, norm resetting and expectation setting with, at the bottom up graduate student level. So that's sort of, where we're seeing this going in the future, given all of what we've already done.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, well, just in a practical sense, in our world, what gets measured gets done. So what I would say is that at the moment, we have UK's leading the way in some ways on this, on the gender pay gap, whereby it looks at it institution-wide. And I would have thought, if you look at economics as a discipline, you would say, well, what if we could get government influence in looking at, organizations that employ ex-economists have to give the gender pay gap of their economists. I say that for two reasons. Firstly, pay of economists and what's happening at the higher end is actually a negative to women who are early career researchers looking at that as a profession, be it academia or outside. So I think pay escalation at the high end is a negative. And if we measure it, that might, and we have to compare, that might narrow the gap. And secondly, I think, no organization wants to be at the bottom of any league table. So I think it starts to encourage faster behavior. So that's just one idea that I would say to influence, UK and other government policies in terms of, there are 4 or 5 key disciplines, I think, across academia where we can see pay is running away. And if you look at LSE, our gender pay gap at LSE medium is 5 point something. You say, wow, that looks remarkable. If you look at economics, it'll be 5 times that if you just look at the economist, which is really, really bad. But it gets hidden. Yeah.
Yes.
So just to follow up on the wage and the pay gap in economics, in particular, I think one of the good things that the UK has is at the academic level is the Higher Education Statistical Agency that records everything about, well, not everything, but a lot of things about academics, including wages. So Erin Hengel actually was working in the Women's Committee report, where for the first time, but we just launched that, and I advise all of you to have a look at that, because for the first time we've put up the wage gaps in economics. It's about 10% for professors. It's much lower, about 5% or 3%, depending on how you look at it. But it is on the high end for professors in economics versus other disciplines. And I think having that information, I have some research showing that pay transparency actually closes gender gaps, increases women's representation. I think having that information across all the sectors, and that's something that we want to do as the UK Women's Network, having the information about the pay gap across economies in all the different sectors, as well as representation, not just the number of women in the economic service, government service, or chief economists in banks, but also what are those pay gaps there. And that requires funds and support, but we'll get there.
Yes.
Just on that as well, I'd be curious to know what proportion of people's time is currently dedicated to this kind of activity, because I think that one thing that would help this to move quicker is if people have the time and money to do this. I imagine, like when I was running the Women in Economics Network, about 5% of my time was earmarked to it, which obviously I spent more than that, and I did work on the weekends and things. But I think for this kind of activity to be people with the passion to do this, to be given the headspace, the time, the resources to do it, and to be rewarded for it as well, equally to what, if someone spent 50% of their time doing this, for it to be rewarded as equally as if they were working on project work in promotion opportunities, I think that's really key. Absolutely.
So thank you, panel. So far we're mostly discussing the Western countries. You mentioned Chile. Let me take you to other low-income countries, especially Africa, where the intersection of low incomes, race, and gender produce very suboptimal outcomes. There are very, very few African economists in top universities or in any universities, and especially African women economists. Very, very few of them. What do we need to do to make that happen? But also, how do we have more of them participating in maybe publishing well, maybe collaborating with other researchers, and also avoiding what Oriana would remember, our experience in Africa. There was a lot of concern about researchers coming from the north, doing projects there and disappearing, what they call mosquitoes. Coming and taking data and then disappearing. So how do we not have a negative contagion and start a positive contagion?
Yeah, so I think this is a very important concern. I think some initiatives, in this case by the CEPR, there is a STEC program, and one of the goals is to create research capacity in low-income countries. This is, so one of the targets is to fund research proposals from people in those countries. So I think that is one, that is one easy goal to have, for funding agencies in developed countries to try to give some funding. When we were looking at those proposals, one of the concerns we had sometimes is that there is this evaluation of, the money that we give in grants. And then the idea is that these papers have to be published in top journals. And sometimes one constraint is that methods change very fast in the north. And then people in the south have access to extremely interesting data. And then they have insightful projects because sometimes they know better the problems that are real and important in these countries that researchers from the north, but they would find it difficult to publish in top tier journals because of this disconnect from methodologies that are more frontier. So one of the proposals that I think that would be useful in terms of these funding agencies would be to actually, do some calls of proposals where you match researchers from the south with researchers from the north. The researchers from the north wouldn't get the money unless they match with researchers from the south. And that's not only affirmative action, because actually, in my view, the researchers from the south often had better data, better questions, the proposals were more interesting, but in terms of methods, they were lacking. And then the researchers from the north had better methods, but worse questions and worse data.
Mm.
So I think it would be like a mutually beneficial type of match, but it has to be kind of like imposed from the agencies.
Yeah, I like other perspective, but just to add, like, how about addressing the root causes of the problem through some way, like addressing educational intervention? For instance, MIT has this micro masters program where they encourage people from Africa and elsewhere to run this remotely and then spend one term at MIT.
Okay.
Yeah.
Basically address this issue.
Mhm.
Other perspectives, yes, Anisha?
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think I really like your idea because there's this Danila, Sarah, and Elira Kuka, they have this adopt a paper program where like a junior researchers get matched with senior researchers and they help shepherd one paper through the publications process. And so what you're suggesting is this, I really like the idea of, you know, the proposal that there's some research, there's some data, and some interesting research question, and a researcher from the South is matched with a researcher, and then, you know, that you create a team that helps navigate the project. But I also agree with you that, you know, opportunities to make those methodological tools accessible. And now so much stuff is done online to make that accessible, and courses online to provide access to the education would be also extremely helpful.
Yeah. So may I just comment that STEG is also doing that? So we have a series of courses that are taught online on frontier methods in macro development. And those are very well attended by students in low income countries. So we are doing that also in the program.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Related to that, I think my own experience having done my PhD in the US and then having almost all my work experience being in the UK, having worked with co-authors in Europe and in the US, there is certainly a division, you know, well, the methods issue may be important between, you know, Africa and the West. My experience has been that what's also very important is the cultural differences that are embedded within the discipline, you know, for good or for bad, in terms of how we approach a question and how we write papers. That if you have been trained in the US, you know this as an external, but it's so much embedded that it's very difficult to learn from somebody that has been doing that all their lives. So what I've some of the things that we do, and actually I've been driven that initiative, is to show these soft skills to students. And I've been, so I did a small workshop in the Royal Economic Society, also in Seville in Spain, another one in France. And I'm just amazed at how little sometimes these students know about the inside of the discipline and how you should form your question, what's important, how you make your paper relevant to the discipline. So I think that's now that, you know, everything is online, as you say, I think it would be great to do that a little bit more. Those sort of maybe mentoring sessions around that, you know, with researchers from the global South. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to add, and it's interesting, I mean, you asked the question because we often look to FCDO to provide the best macro answers to this, because we know from some of the case studies we've looked at, you know, what came first, wealth generation or economists. You look at India, and the most prominent economist I've had a chance to talk to was 20 minutes with Manmohan Singh, just shortly after he had left the post of Prime Minister of India. And of course, it's interesting, as an economist, his intervention in the 70s led to a number of things that then mean India changed. Now, he's not the only one, but there's a whole group of economists who, due to structural funding, go to places, in his case, Cambridge and Oxford, and go back to the home country And I think that's the trick of it. And I think, looking at IGC and where you are at the moment, I think to impact that requires something bigger than us just at institutional level. And I think you're in the right place to say, how can that funding be created in a way which means they get the wealth of the knowledge needed, but then the individuals spend that back and the energy in their own environments. And there are ways to do that, like there were reasons why Manmohan Singh had to go back to India because of the way he was funded, et cetera, which if it isn't, you find often that gets lost elsewhere. And often those people that we thought were doing work in Africa are now in US or whatever. So I think that's part of the challenge. And part of that is the structure of how we set up the funding, how we do think, IGC is an example in LSE, but there's lots of examples. And then how we ensure that that knowledge is actually sitting inside those countries, because that will then create wealth generation. Because, the knowledge of the economics knowledge is part of the contribution to how you create your wealth generating economy. Yeah.
So you mentioned this and also, but your earlier response on HR policies, you mentioned about like ways of correcting for this bias or motherhood penalty, as they say, like or wage differentials. So what could other organizations be doing? And not just a question, not just for you, but for everyone. What are the lessons coming out from this, from your work? And what else is not happening in terms of organizational policies, both in academia, but also maybe other organizations that also hire economists, women economists, coming from minority backgrounds. What could be done to change the practices? Yes.
I feel I'm talking too much. Stop
No.
me. But one of the things that has come out in the annual event, we had the Athena Swan chair. The Athena Swan is this accreditation program for UK academics or UK universities, although they've expanded now to the US and to some other places. And in 2015, they opened up this accreditation program for gender equality to economics department and social sciences more general. And what she was saying is that economics departments are not actually applying for accreditation. They don't seem to be interested in applying for accreditation. So I think those, these accreditation programs are quite important because they send a signal that is, that you care about equality. And in some disciplines, for example, you need to be accredited in order to get funding from certain funders. It's not in economics, so maybe that's why, or maybe there is the culture of economics more broadly. But certainly we can do a lot more.
Any other perspective? So
I
Yeah,
think
please.
there's some questions.
yeah, let's open up to questions. So yes, please. No, okay, you're waiting for the mic.
Thanks. So my question is more related to the interaction with class, because right now all of you are working in institutions which are thought leaders and have influence over the way economics is molded to some extent. I'm curious as to how the interventions and the policies that you are implementing interact between gender and class, because I feel like we often it's often helping the most white privileged women. So that's one question. And the second is just a comment that the IGCs also run a researcher matching, and we've done it as an RCT. So it's had some good preliminary findings.
Shall we gather questions or do we want
Right.
to? It's a gender and class. Yes, let's have 2 or 3 questions and then, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I'm interested in something that has not been mentioned, I think, at all, or maybe once, which is that one of our core activities in universities is teaching. And I would be very interested to think about the status of teaching in economics and how that interacts and intersects with the status of women, of people from underrepresented minorities, and the class question, which Anna Stantrey was here, she would be providing us with very clear evidence about the fact that economics is an elitist discipline But I wanted really to bring to the fore the question of teaching as part of that really distinguishes between research institutions and science more generally, and the university. And so there are several dimensions of this. There's the question of what is taught. There's a mention of trying to recruit more women into economics that I think is at least can be argued that has something to do with what is taught when they get there. And the problem for the tenure process, where all of the emphasis, I mean, every paper was about publications in top 5, enormous pressure to basically do the minimum possible to fill the teaching matrix with the least effort, and that's just something that should be ticked off. And I think what we should be doing is really making the case for the complementarity between teaching and research from the very beginning, and that's the way to teach a good curriculum. It's a way to attract a much more diverse audience into economics and to improve the pipeline. But that really requires transformation across the profession. So I'd be interested to think what other people, where we get this even into the conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Wendy. So let's have one more question and then.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that currently 4 of 5 grants that are available through the British Academy are actually following the rule that you suggested before. So this is happening. It's live now. So there is this joint application process by 2 researchers and with the requirements that you were mentioned before. So
Excellent.
I guess.
So gender and class, curriculum and teaching.
Yeah, so maybe I have an answer that might address both of the questions, which is let me talk about 2 of the interventions that we funded and we're waiting to see the results in terms of encouraging sort of undergraduates from different backgrounds, whether it be along the lines of gender, race, class, etc. What we found is that if you go to undergraduate populations, there are a lot of people who you would want to be interested in economics and they're not. And the question is why? And it's often because they don't see themselves reflected in the profession, either in terms of the way they look or in terms of the questions that are interesting to them. Right? So if you're interested in inequality and your Econ 101 class never talks about inequality, we only talk about efficiency, that's not going to be something that interests you as a discipline, right? So one of the interventions that we have funded is plug and play modules, which are just 5-10-minute videos, which have economists from different backgrounds talking about things that people may not necessarily think of as standard economics questions related to money, right? So most people think economics is about money, and it's about so much more than money, right? And so to sort of in the Econ 101 class to introduce, the diversity of the profession, both in terms of the ideas, in terms of the people who are studying these topics, etc., so that people see themselves reflected in the profession and are drawn to it. The other on the gender part is one of the other interventions is to replace 1 week of the economics curriculum with a gender lens. So a sort of a module on gender, such as labor market discrimination, the gender wage gap, family economics, etc. And then so these interventions are actually playing with the curriculum to make the discipline be more accessible. And then what they want to see is, do we see a greater uptake in terms of people who want to be economics majors or go into that field?
Let's hear from others, but reminds me of the great contribution of Wendy and her colleague. The core textbook is a great way also of having these conversations in class.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, so a small comment about the teaching. So this I'm going to refer again to the work by this sociologist from Berkeley that she's been studying this data from the PhD survey in the US. And one of the trends that she documented was how there was a shift in academia towards fewer tenure track positions where women are the minority, and more short-term contracts on teaching positions. So a lot of the teaching in universities was done by women who dropped out from the kind of STAR track into this teaching track. And those were on temporary contracts that were renewed every year. This is in like UC system, like top universities in the US. And sometimes those contracts would be stopped without notice. So there was no commitment. So this talks about kind of a broader trend, I think, to overvalue research and undervalue teaching, that I think is worrisome in the sense that, of course, we should care a lot about the quality of education of the next generations and the job quality for teachers. Why do teachers not get rewarded for, the quality of their teaching? Why they don't have prestigious and stable careers where they can, ascend, but they are put into this sort of less, I would say, less prestigious and less stable jobs. I think this is a worrisome trend, and probably, there should be more research about the consequences of that for the quality of education. I haven't seen any research on what are the efficiency costs of this trend, but I think it's important. Yeah.
Just maybe to add on the research on the teaching. Sorry, I just have the data from the report here, and there is a worrying trend insofar that teaching is not recognized as much as research in the profession, because women economists are taking up these teaching tracks in the UK, which is a relatively new sort of career path. So just to give you the numbers, for traditional research tracks, it's gone up since in the last decade from 22% to 27%. The teaching track has gone up from 30% to 40%, the share of women in teaching only tracks. And we know it's very heterogeneous across universities, but we know that career paths in teaching tracks are not yet recognized as much as research only tracks. So
let's go to the next round, Oriana. Yes, is there a mic?
Two things. First, thank you to the panel. You're fantastic. We have canvassed some questions from the audience before the panel, and these have been upvoted. So in 1 minute, I'll give the line to Sveva, who's going to read the most popular question that our audience has for the panel. Before doing that, I would like to make two very quick points. And one is an observation, which is that we're all doing the mentoring independently. Maybe we should coordinate. Then a shameless piece of advertising. The mentees of G2LM LIC are here today with us. And tomorrow we have a presentation session with them. So anybody who's around between 11 and 1, Samira will send details to this group. So very welcome. The second is a question which you can take together with the Sveva's questions, which is the following. We focus on women, which is right. But the problem of culture, you say, twice as many women complain about culture. 40% of men complain about culture. That's like half of the men don't like culture in economics.
It was 20%. 40% of women and 20%.
And 20% of men. That's still 1/5. When we did the pay equity exercise, there were 20% of men well below the regression line. So it's a matter of equity throughout. So, I mean, I'm not saying that, of course, women have it easier, but that we shouldn't lose sight of other dimensions of inequality because they all interact together. I think we should work for a more coherent culture in economics. Sorry, end of blur. Sveva, do you want to read the most popular question?
Okay, so yeah, like collecting the question from the Q&A, the one of the main thoughts was about the fact that mostly in developed countries, that people tend to, so in a sense, overestimate the bias against women. And so there is a lot of research in academia saying that, for example, in countries that are more advanced in terms of gender rights, women tend to overestimate the bias that is against them, and men tend to be more to underestimate the super. So what do you think that these apply to in terms of policy to your fields?
Okay, so I can tell you my personal experience with this. For me, and I think for many women in the profession, the climate survey by the American Economic Association was a wake-up call. I think because we were raised by the 60s generation of feminists, we were raised with the idea that there was full equality between men and women. At least that was my case. And I never felt any discrimination until I started my job as an assistant professor, and I was the only woman. So I think, if anything, I was completely unaware of any bias. And I think this is the case for many women of my generation, that we came to the assistant professor job completely unaware of any bias because we hadn't suffered any until that level. And then at that time, I would say many women started suffering in silence, different difficulties. And the AA climate survey was a wake-up call. For me, I remember reading it and saying, oh my God, I mean, this is not me that I was weird, that I was feeling uncomfortable in conferences. It's not me that I was weird, that I was feeling people were not taking me seriously. It was not me that I was not clear and people were interrupting me so much in seminars. And frankly, I think talking to other women in these retreats, etc., many of the women in my generation, we had this type of experience. So maybe now it's different, but for us, I think we were raised with this idea that there was full equality of opportunities. That's what we thought. We experienced something different, and it took talking to other women going through the same thing for us to realize that there were these biases and that they were making it difficult for many of us. So that's my personal view on this.
Yeah, others, and Laura, you should also share your experience from GS and maybe government.
In what respect do you mean? What do you mean, sorry?
Do you think
Not
there's
picking on you, but-
do you think there's a that we're overestimating the bias against women?
So I mean, when I was sort of the same, so I'm probably a little bit younger than you. But in terms but I was probably the same, that when I first started work, a colleague invited me along to a women's event, and I literally said, oh, it's a bit bra burning, isn't it? That's not really me. And I wouldn't have described myself as a feminist at that point. There's probably a class thing there as well, intersecting. But it was only when I first started experiencing work, and it's the subtle things. It's this, and it's not, I'm very lucky that I've not experienced any really overt sexism. It's been people assuming that the person who I manage is actually my boss because they're a man.
Yeah.
It's things like that that just chip away at you, and they're not big enough to mention. They're not big enough to make a big deal of them, but and so it's quite easy to, like you said, be silent about it and just sit with it. But then it's about sharing it with people. Yeah. But then I think there is also, we can get ourselves riled up a little bit sometimes as well by oversharing. So I'm not sure if that's controversial.
I just remember my favorite anecdote. I mean, I was at a conference, macroeconomics, all men. And then we finished seeing a paper and we go out for a coffee break and we're discussing the paper. I was the only female. And I make a comment about the paper. And then the senior colleague in the group, after I finish my comment, he says, as Joe said, na, 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 and he repeats my comment and comments on my comment. And I was like, okay, this cannot be. I mean, John, of course, didn't say, look, that was Paula's comment. And then the funny thing is that I thought, okay, what I think is interesting about this anecdote is that this senior colleague truly remembered that the comment was made by a male, because I think in his way of thinking, there was no way a female would make a meaningful comment about a paper, right? So this is an unconscious bias. I think many women, we had this type of experience, right? So I think these are not bad intentions. This male senior colleague didn't have any bad intention. He just happened to remember that the comment was made by a man due to some cognitive constraint that, that he had. Yeah.
Yeah, let's hear from others.
I mean, surely none of us believe we're overestimating this, do we? I mean, the real challenge was not the years that have gone by where you had conscious bias, but the years that are in front of us when you've got unconscious bias, where people and organizations don't even realize what's happening on it. And there are all sorts of studies, the number of times men ask a panelist a question when it's a woman, et cetera, all sorts of little studies that bring out the level of bias. I mean, this is going to take time to change. But clearly, we're at a certain point. But the one thing we can't start believing is that we're at the end of that journey. We're at the beginning. The conscious bias is the easy thing. I mean, I'm a perfect example of conscious bias. I'm a Sikh, wear a turban. At 21, I cut my hair. I do everything possible to look like a Western man, and I've been successful in life. Yeah, but I'm a bad example. You know that. I'm a really bad example. Yeah. I look at my son-in-law who wears a turban. He's quite senior in a bank. The first time my daughter said they want to marry him, I said, is he going to get on? Because, he wears a turban. All sorts of biases. So we're all part of the trajectory of our time. But the important thing is, certainly for women, we got to remember the journey has only just begun. And there are, those that study genetics will tell you there are deep-seated biases that are passed on generation to generation. Those that study social sciences will tell you that there are deep-seated. This will take time. We're only just beginning, I think.
The last month, while traveling in a country not to be named, we were stopped at a roadblock, and my colleague mentioned to the cop saying, this is a senior British official who is visiting, and he takes a look at me and says, no. Takes a look at my next colleague, woman colleague, no, third colleague, no. And then takes a look at the fourth person, the junior most person who is like a white male, said, yes. Let's go. Any other perspectives, Anusha?
Well, I'll share my personal experience with the American Economic Association survey, which I think, as Paula was saying, was a wake-up call, because I personally never thought that I was, that there were any biases in economics, or that they had happened to me. Let's put it that way. And here I am. No, I am a feminist, and I was very aware of biases in society, but in economics, I hadn't really experienced those. And there was this, and I did the survey for research purposes, and I answered this question. Have you stopped going to a conference, to a seminar, to a workshop, somewhere else, because you didn't feel comfortable? And I said, yeah, my first reaction was to say no. And then I thought to myself, wait a minute, I've never applied to an economics department. And at that point, it was the whole thing open. Why, right? Then I asked myself why, and I've always felt more comfortable with social scientists, not necessarily economists, and it is about how they behave in the seminar. They respect my work. They respect when I say something about in not just me, but other women as well, right? So So for me, that really brought it to life. And so we are, if it happened to me and I am an activist and I think we are very, very far from overestimating anything.
Yeah, so I'm just curious about why people think that we're overestimating this bias and what that has to do with, increased gender rights. I'm just curious as to where that perception is coming from. So maybe somebody from the audience would like to share that. But as I mentioned earlier, I think that economics does suffer from a bias against bias, which is what makes us acculturated to think there's no bias. And then that was why it was a wake-up call, because we were forced to engage with the actual situations. And the one thing that I've realized through my years in the profession is my first job when I was finishing my PhD, I did 2 years in a sort of postdoc at the University of Chicago, which has a very, let's say, active seminar culture. And I remember my advisor calling me when I went to give a talk there as a PhD student saying, "Don't worry, Anusha, at Chicago, they do it for sport." And there was there's this culture of you have to sort of step up and be able to take that aggressive questioning. And, it's a form of hazing. And we think it's okay. And people will say, "Oh, I was just being brutally honest." And like someone said, people who say they're brutally honest are enjoying the brutality as much as the honesty. And so I do think that that's sort of a problem in our profession in terms of culture. And if there are people who are turned away from that aggression, we can't really blame them.
Thank you. So Imran, so you have both are a question, but you also done so quite a lot in this space in many different capacities. So why don't you share your perspective?
So I just want to say on the leadership last point and actually connect it to what Wendy mentioned before, which I think is really sort of the crux of the matter. That, I mean, some of the data we've seen presented today, but also outside, shows that these problems are worse in economics than in just about any other discipline we try to measure it against. And so what's different about economics? And so it seems that something that always strikes me is that we're an incredibly hierarchical discipline. We have a very clear hierarchy of journals, a very clear hierarchy of departments. As a result, the returns to being able to bargain and negotiate mobility are much higher than in other disciplines. The weight that we put on research versus other activities is different than in other disciplines. And ultimately, that means that the role of connections and networks becomes greater than in other disciplines. And that one issue, networks can be great for some things, but they don't generate social change at a very rapid pace and lead to, some of the types of anecdotes or prize that we've heard about. So do members of the panel think that those sort of fundamental issues about the way that our discipline is organized do actually interrelate to these issues, or actually there's something separate there? And if they do, I mean, what can we do to tackle some of those fundamental ways that we're organized in terms of our underlying hierarchy and hence how we view each other?
Great question. So
Yeah, I think this was one of the issues that was brought up in the climate survey, in the comments, right? The extreme elitism of the profession. I think that's something also that I know has come up in discussions in the ERC council. Members of other disciplines that are not economics were surprised by the fact that economists knew who was going to get the grants, the advanced ones, especially so people don't apply. Now there's this issue that in economics, people don't even apply to ERC grants because they know they have no chance to get them if they don't have certain top publications, while in other disciplines, there's not such a clear hierarchy of journals or departments, and it's easier for them to judge the projects themselves, right? So there is a flatter probability across people in different disciplines for getting these type of grants. And I think that that definitely, if you have a very hierarchical profession, that is going to increase inequality in all dimensions. So that, I guess, one question that is unclear is what's the purpose served by that hierarchy, and whether I guess most economists would think that it's good because it's a very steep reward profile with respect to productivity. I'm not so convinced that that's the case, but I guess maybe we should have some research, trying to understand to what extent the steepness of incentives is good or bad for productivity.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. I've written a couple of papers about the NBER, and sort of, whose papers get accepted on the NBER Summer Institute, which is a very elite conference, and what is the gender composition of that, as well as who is a member of the NBER, which is it's a very elite network, and who has access by race and gender to that network. And so I think, we do need more research to understand this elitism. That's why I like Angela Stansbury's work so much. And I really think that addressing this elitism, because I want to come back to the discipline itself and the marketplace for ideas. We can't be a discipline that thinks that there's people don't have good ideas outside of Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? And I'm not being facetious, because there are really people in Cambridge, Massachusetts think that that's, if you're there, you're smart, and everyone else is not really. And so therefore your ideas are not worth all of that, all that much. And I think like a fundamental problem of elitism is that of our top 5 journals, 2 are in-house, right? So the JPE and the QJE, which are in the top 5, are house journals, which means that, graduate students and assistant professors and Harvard professors can publish in the QJE, or, and MIT can more easily, publish in the QJE or in the JPE, which is a Chicago house journal. So if you're going to talk about research productivity and the fact that, did you get an A publication, 2 out of those 5 are run as house journals. So, I mean, we really do have a problem with elitism.
I would say yes, we need more research. We always need more research, but we've been researching this particular topic of elitism in the course of the top 5 in particular. Jim Heckman was the one that talked about it, if anybody. So I think we need to really start thinking about how we change those structures. And that's the real challenge, because that needs more.
Thank you. So
I was just going to say, don't take elitism away. Let's just allow other people into it.
Yeah.
Men have had a good 150 years since the revolution. We can share some of it now.
sounds good. So we have a question from the floor. Then we'll almost
So-
close to the end.
Thank you so much. Mine is not really a question, but I was just listening to the conversation and the numbers that you're giving on the gender. And it's really interesting that this conversation on gender is here. And it took me back to my days when I was doing my undergraduate. And if I remember correctly, there was only one female lecturer who taught me in development economics for the 4 years I was in undergraduate. So really, if the numbers are like that in US and in Europe, then it's only worse in developing countries and like in Africa, so to say. So what I would really say, just to also echo what the panel has said, is that we should be very intentional in this conversation, so that even when we are having our conferences that are stationed in Africa, this is something that we should talk about. Because as you said, people could be going through the biases, but they're not aware that really there's bias. So it's a good conversation to carry along and be intentional about it. The second thing that you spoke about building capacity. I was just looking at how my country is, for example. We have very good data sets. We have very good research problems that
I look at Europe, for example, anything and everything is a research problem that has been evaluated. But there are a lot of things that have happened in the developing countries, but there could be no research that is associated with it. And it could be because of the methodology issues that we have, or we have data and we just don't know what to do with it. So I think the suggestions that you give, especially on if you want a grant, then you have to partner with somebody from the developing countries, will really help in building capacity for economists in these countries, and especially women. Thank you very much.
Very well said. This is also a lesson for not just the panel, but also for me. We at FCDO also care quite a lot about building more capacity and good and bad ways. India mentioned that already. All the funding we provide, we also require people to partner more with researchers from Africa. But I also wonder how effective that is. Does that become more like a box ticking exercise? And how much more should be done to tackle the root causes of that and go not just use that as a funding mechanism as a way of addressing that, but also use other things. Any final reflections from the panel? I think we're almost at the end. Any final reflection that we close?
Just want to, thank Oriana and Imran for organizing this. This has been very, very nice, very interesting.
Thank you.
Really fantastic conversation. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, it really shows that we've come a long way and there is some way to go still, but very good.
Thank you for inviting a practitioner.
Great to have you here.
Thank you very much, the panel. Thank you, Oriana and Imran, and thank you. Even more thanks to the audience. Thank you very much.
So we have come a long way. I remember it was about 2-3 years ago where Imran was over dinner saying, "But I don't understand why we're economists, we have all these great ideas, but we never apply them to solve the problems of economics." Our children are used to this. They're just rolling their eyes and we're like, oh God, let's start again. And I said, of course, we have to do this. And that's how this thing was born, over a plate of pasta. And it's come a long way. So I want to thank many people. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank our wonderful panel. And I want to thank especially Samira and Lubala. I don't see you guys, but without you, none of this would have happened. And I think that we've set new problems for the next round. Thank you so much.
Thank you.